Hi, this is Professor Laracy, and this is the lecture on Charles W Chesnutt's The Goophered Grapevine. And I'm going to be reading later in the second half of the lecture from the essay that I posted on your course content called Testing and Tricking by Montgomery. And I will just be giving you some highlights from that essay. You do not have to read all of the essay, but you might want to read along and see the parts that I focus on during my lecture. To start off with, Charles Chesnutt was one of the first African Americans to be published in mainstream magazines and journals like the Atlantic Monthly, and that was in 1887 to begin with, and they didn't know that he was of mixed race, half black, half white, until 1899. So that's 12 years in which he wrote in racial anonymity. But he brings up some really good points that are quoted in your introduction in your textbook on page 228, and I'll quote from him when he said, "I think I might write a book. I must write a book," in his journal in 1880. He talks about the racial system in America as a caste system, and I think this is a really appropriate word that points out that race is a canard or a red herring or a distraction from class in America, and so they are interchangeable. "I shall write for a purpose, a high, holy purpose, and this will inspire me to greater effort. The object of my writings would be not so much the elevation of the colored people as the elevation of the whites, for I consider the unjust spirit of caste, which is so insidious as to pervade a whole nation, and so powerful as to subject a whole race and all connected with it to scorn and social ostracism, I consider this a barrier to the moral progress of the American people, and I would be one of the first to head a determined, organized crusade against it." So that's what his writing is for. You'll notice over and over again as I am choosing how to analyze text in this survey class, in which we read a lot but we don't get to read very deeply, that I'm focusing on function, what a text does to the society and to the reader that it is operative in. And so Chesnutt's call to change a culture is a very clear one. I think that's what literature always does, sometimes more obviously than others. And Chesnutt's call to write to a white audience is also unique and specific to the time period in which he's writing. As African American writing gets more popular and more published, and time goes on from the Civil War and the Harlem Renaissance begins, writers like W.B. Du Bois and Langston Hughes will say that African Americans need to write only to an African American audience of only African American things. They get the white man's readership and perspective out of their concerns so that they could write for themselves, of themselves, and to themselves. And that is an early call from Langston Hughes that later, about 50 years later, he'll write other essays that suggest how to write in an unracialized fashion. But early on he writes an essay which we will read later in our syllabus called The Negro Artist and the Racial Mountain, in which he encourages African American writers to get rid of considerations of white influence and white readerships. So you see Chesnutt doing something quite different in that he's acknowledging that forms, functions, systems, and structures of racism are much harder to be made visible to white people than to minorities. Minorities know they're being oppressed. Minorities know when they're being discriminated against, whereas white readers are much, much more often unable to see the system in which they benefit so strongly. So writing to a white audience has the function of trying to change the nation's consciousness on race. At the top of 230, you see questions of dialect, black vernacular, and local color being addressed. In your discussion post question that I ask you to think about dialect and Chesnutt's use of dialect. I ask you to look up signifying and the history of signifying in African American literature, and I ask you to think about how you feel about dialect, and to look at this story, The Goophered Grapevine, both from a straightforward perspective and from a signifying perspective. So let's get started with signifying. Signifying is historically an African way of communicating and storytelling in which the power structure is often inverted and the person who is speaking seems to be disempowered and in fact actually manipulates situations in order to get his way, his or her way. They are trickster figures, which we'll get into a little bit later. Now, as we look at Uncle Julius, you can see that he is called shrewd. And there are several ways to look at the text. In one way, there's the story from a northerner going down to North Carolina who is talked to by this kind of old darky Sambo character that seems to be reinforcing the romanticized notions of how good plantation life is and how good the South is, because he never left it, and he sat on a log and stayed there forever. And from the perspective of the northerner, Uncle Julius tells this huge tall tale about magic and conjuring, and it's unbelievable. But fascinating that there would be people who believed in magic and believed in conjuring. And it seems from the northerner's perspective that Uncle Julius is telling the story in order to keep Uncle Julius from buying the farm with the grapes on it, because he's trying to tell him that the grapes are goophered or bewitched by this conjure woman who has goophered them so that if you eat any, you'll die within a year. But Uncle Julius is immune to it for some reason, and the northerner thinks that he's really figured out the game and is really smart when he goes ahead and buys the land and out of the goodness of his heart offers Julius a job. But if you really think about it, Julius, at the end of his tall tale, storytelling, exaggeration, and double entendre, is not only educating the white readership about the conjuring power, but he ends up getting remunerated or paid a salary to do exactly what he had been doing all those years. And so in that way, his signifying and storytelling results in an inversion in the power structure where he gets paid to do what he had been doing anyway. And so that's how it can be seen as a signifying tale. The most quotable quote, I think, that to put us in the middle of these things, I asked the students in class whether they trusted Julius, whether they believed in magic, whether they were able to suspend their disbelief and believe in the conjure story. And mostly they thought that Julius was magical, was a reliable narrator, but was also superstitious and perhaps manipulative. And I asked them how they felt about reading the dialect, which is hard to understand. And some students said that it's hard to understand. Most students felt that it resulted in a kind of realism and a kind of local color, sociological, archaeological treasure to be able to read the dialect and made the character live and made us feel like we were in the location much better than some sort of mainstream dialect would have. And so that ultimately, for the purposes of realism in character and for interest level in character, that dialect was useful and good in this scenario, even though it does run the risk of making Uncle Julius look ignorant and backwoods, especially when he's telling conjure stories. But the fact that Julius is victorious in his storytelling goes a long way towards showing that the dialect does not really limit him in his power. So the quote that I wanted to look at that I think is really important, though, is not actually dialogue at all, but at the bottom of 232, where the northerner is looking at Julius and he says, "There was a shrewdness in his eyes, too, which was not altogether African, and which, as we afterwards learned from experience, was indicative of a corresponding shrewdness in his character." In fact, this shrewdness is very African. And so this is going to bring me to the reading of the essay that I linked you to, Testing and Tricking, Chesnutt's The Goophered Grapevine. Okay, I've got to get my my screen clear here. Okay, so what we see here in the Goophered Grapevine is a great example of signifying. And if you want to read along with me in Montgomery's Testing and Tricking, she says, when Charles Chesnutt wrote the Goophered Grapevine and the passing of Grandison, he engaged in the African tradition of storytelling that has been passed down for generations. His stories evidence the oral heritage of African peoples, stories within stories. You see that in this story. Spoken language, you see that in the dialect. Call and response, that's not in this story. Hyperbole or exaggeration is, personification is not, and signifying certainly is. Chesnutt introduces the lore of conjuration, African American hoodoo beliefs and practices, to a white reading public. In Chesnutt's work, this validates the African experience, revealing its continued existence in a land where there had been a deliberate attempt to eradicate the experience. So the conjuring stories and the characters come straight out of Africa into America. Chesnutt's The Conjure Woman is a collection of stories showing the magic and the cast spells and the power inherent in that. The writer here, Montgomery, goes in to tell us about how conjure filled a deep need in the slaves' lives for a weapon to invoke against the arbitrary and often violent circumstances that made up his existence, while saying that oftentimes conjuring is depicted as just proof of fear and powerlessness among African Americans. At the same time, in Chesnutt, it seems to be a locus for power. Montgomery goes on to talk about the African cosmological system, in which there are orishas, or secondary divinities, representing different aspects of a supreme being, and an elegba, which is a trickster. Now, tricksters are very, very common in literature, and we'll get to them in later on when we're looking at American Indian literature. And tricksters usually stir things up and cause change that is initially painful, but almost always results in progress. So there's a particular type of trickster here, an elegba, who is a gatekeeper in the crossroads, at the threshold of every decision. And you see Uncle Julius sitting on a log is definitely representing a decision and a crossroads, not only of the northerner and whether he's going to buy the land, but of the South and how the South is going to recover, and whether it's going to include the limitless resources, almost limitless resources of the African American community or not. And then the trickster figure has a long history in African diasporic folktales. I want to write down that word that I just said, diasporic, which and then talk to you about a diaspora. A diaspora is a dispersion. So the first dispersion of peoples, see here, diasporic and diaspora, is the first dispersion of peoples is of the Jewish dispersion from their homeland out into the other continents. Then you have an African diaspora, an Irish diaspora, an Italian diaspora. In fact, it's been said there are far more Irish in the Irish diaspora than in Ireland itself. So when we talk about a diaspora, we talk about a culture and an ethnicity and traditions that adhere to groups of people, even though they don't live in one unified location, when they go out into other continents and other parts of the world. And so the trickster is a figure that has been in African and African diasporic folktales for a very long time. And we'll talk about Brer Rabbit very soon. It's an earthly reflection of an African cosmological system. You see this in literature. The essay quotes Paul Laurence Dunbar's We Wear the Mask, and I'll read that to you because it's a contemporary piece with Chesnutt. It's a little bit later. We wear the mask that grins and lies, that hides our cheeks and shades our eyes, this debt we pay to human guile, with torn and bleeding hearts we smile, and mouth with myriad subtleties. In these stories, there is a masking, there is a secret keeping, there is saying one thing and meaning another. And this is true in the Brer Rabbit tales, where Brer Rabbit tricks his way out of trouble, begging not to be thrown in the briar patch, which is precisely where he wanted to be. And then also, in addition to the Brer Rabbit tales from Song of the South that you may have heard of, there's also the character of the signifying monkey, which began to be very popular in like the 1920s on the streets of big cities, where small kids began the your mama jokes and just telling one another off and tall talking in order to assert their power through the power of their storytelling and the subversion of power inequities through that storytelling. So that's all the work I'm going to do with that essay. In order to look at signifying and the context of signifying, I'm going to suggest to you that you go to YouTube and look up the Brer Rabbit Song of the South videos, and you can see the Tar Baby and the Briar Patch stories, and how Brer Rabbit is that trickster, that Elegba trickster, just like Uncle Julius is an Elegba trickster. You can also look up the Signifying Monkey poem. You can look up a lot of Signifying Monkey performance art, and I'll warn you, there's a lot of cussing in it, but it is, I said, the origin of the Your Mama jokes, and you know what those are all about, I believe. I don't know if you guys tell your mama jokes. Do millennials tell your mama jokes? I don't know. But as you're reading the Goophered Grapevine, the Conjured Grapevine, think about how all these issues of dialect and folklore collection and the need to represent African Americans as powerful and smart and important players on the reconstruction of the South correlate to show how Chesnutt uses those things together and signifying to investigate the importance of reconstructing the South properly. And then I would ask you, which version of the story do you like better? The straightforward story where the Northerner outsmarts Uncle Julius and buys the land anyway and is not tricked into running away? Or the signifying story where Uncle Julius wins because he talks the Northerner into not only buying the land, but paying him to stay on the land, which is what he was going to do anyway. And so that's our introduction to African American literature in the Reconstruction period and the concept of signifying, which we will see over and over and over again.